Welcome, dear listener, to another charming tale from the village of St. Mary Mead, where the roses bloom as sweetly as ever, and where human nature, alas, remains as curious and unpredictable as it always has been. Tonight's mystery is titled Miss Marple and the Vanishing Doctor. Settle in with a warm cup of tea and allow yourself to be transported to an English village of the 1950s, where beneath the tranquil hedgerows and polite conversation, secrets stir. Chapter 1: A Doctor Disappears. The morning in St. Mary Mead dawned bright and serene, the kind of early summer day when the sunlight fell gently upon thatched roofs, and the hedgerows along the lanes seemed to rustle with secret life. The roses in the vicarage garden bowed gracefully beneath the weight of their blooms, while the sound of church bells drifted faintly across the fields, announcing nothing more urgent than the hour of 9. To the casual eye, it was a morning like any other, calm and orderly, with the small English village moving at its usual, comforting pace. Mr. Petherick, the retired solicitor, had already taken up his habitual post upon the bench outside the post office, a folded newspaper upon his knee, which he scarcely read, but held as though it were an official prop. Beside him, Mrs. Weatherby emerged from the shop, tucking a tin of condensed milk into her basket, and announcing to no one in particular that the grocer's supply of tea had improved. The postmistress, Miss Hartnell, leaned over her counter to remark to a customer that she had heard a motor car at a very late hour the night before, but she could not for the life of her imagine who it might have been. Such chatter formed the very pulse of St. Mary Mead, and it might have gone entirely unnoticed had there not arisen that morning a whisper, faint at first but spreading with the quiet persistence of ivy across a wall. The whisper concerned none other than Dr. Leonard Hayward, the village physician, a man of solid reputation and regular habits, who for the past 15 years had tended to everything from chilblains to fevers, armchair opposite, already relishing the recital. Well, it seems he was last seen on Tuesday evening, yesterday, that is, walking towards his surgery with his bag in hand. Several people can attest to it. Mrs. Bantry saw him near the High Street, and young Tommy Briggs swears he carried his medical bag, just as usual. But this morning, when his first patients arrived, the surgery was locked. They waited and waited, but the doctor did not come. And now Mrs. Hayward has been telling people that he never returned home at all last night. Miss Marple made a small sympathetic noise, though her blue eyes were thoughtful. That does sound unlike him. He is most conscientious. To fail an appointment, yes, that is very strange indeed. Strange? Cried Mrs. Price Ridley, whose love of drama was exceeded only by her certainty of being well informed. It is positively sinister, Jane. I always said that wife of his was too young for him. Mark my words, she's at the bottom of it. Men who marry women half their age must expect to find themselves in difficulties. Miss Marple merely folded her knitting upon her lap. She was not one to contradict her neighbors outright, though she was far from accepting Mrs. Price Ridley's pronouncements at face value. Instead, she asked, "Has the police been informed?" "Oh, Inspector Craddock has been sent for, though I dare say he will say it's no business for the police. Men go off of their own accord often enough, though not, I think, our doctor. He is a respectable man, most respectable. No, Jane, I shall be very much surprised if we do not find something darker behind this." When Mrs. Price Ridley at last bustled away, clearly gratified at having been the bearer of such news, Miss Marple sat for a long moment, her knitting untouched in her lap. To the casual observer, she might have seemed a mild, elderly spinster absorbed in trifles. But within her quiet mind, thoughts moved swiftly, patterns taking shape as they so often did when human behavior fell short of expectation. A village doctor was a man bound by routine, as much as the postman had been seen that morning pale and distracted, insisting to anyone who would listen that her husband must have been called suddenly to London. But, as Mrs. Bantry put it in a lowered voice, she did not seem quite so anxious as a wife ought to be, Jane. Not anxious in the right way. By midday, Inspector Craddock himself had arrived, looking harassed, as he often did when drawn into village matters that promised more complication than crime. He stood outside the doctor's surgery speaking to Mrs. Hayward, who was dressed impeccably in a pale blue frock, her golden hair neatly arranged beneath a summer hat. She seemed the picture of composure, yet her hands trembled as she clutched her handkerchief. "He is simply overtired," she said, with an almost practiced air of reassurance. "The constant demands, you know. He may have gone to London for a day or two. It would not be the first time." But Inspector Craddock looked unconvinced, and Miss Marple, standing unobtrusively nearby, thought the lady's choice of words most curious. It would not be the first time. Did that imply the doctor had vanished before? Or was it an attempt to persuade herself as much as others? The surgery was opened by means of a key kept at the vicarage for emergencies. Within, everything appeared orderly, yet there were odd details. A half-written prescription lay open upon the desk, the ink not yet blotted. The doctor's pen laid aside as though he had been called away suddenly. The medical bag was missing, which was only to be expected if he had gone out on a call. But there had been no such call. At least none reported. The little waiting room was empty, its chairs neatly aligned. A faint smell of antiseptic hung in the air, mingling with the dust of unopened windows. There was no sign of struggle, no disarray. Only that unfinished prescription, its final line reading, "For Mrs. C. Hayward, sleeping draught, 2 ounces to be taken nightly." Miss Marple looked at the page with her quiet, bird-like gaze. It was a most interesting clue, though she said nothing. That afternoon she returned home to her cottage, where the kettle hummed on the hob, and the roses out voices along the lane, and allowed her needles to click softly together. She knew she would not rest until the fate of Dr. Hayward was uncovered, for puzzles such as these, however troubling to others, were to her the natural fabric of life in the village. Threads of deceit and truth, woven together, waiting only for the careful eye to discern the pattern, and thus, with the quiet certainty of one who has lived long and observed much, Miss Marple resolved that she would discover what had become of the vanished doctor. Chapter 2. Suspects in the Village. The sun lingered warmly over St. Mary Mead that Wednesday afternoon, though the pleasant weather did little to soften the tension humming beneath the village's surface. Wherever one went, the grocer's shop, the Women's Institute Hall, or the path beside the churchyard wall, the talk was the same. Dr. Hayward had not been seen since Tuesday evening. A respectable man, they all agreed. But perhaps even respectable men had secrets. Miss Marple, walking briskly though carefully with her parasol, knew the village well enough to understand that in every case of sudden disappearance, one must look not to dramatic strangers but to those nearest at hand. It is human nature, she reflected, for those closest to a person to be most entangled in his affairs. A doctor, well liked and trusted though he might be, was no exception, and as she thought of the vanished man, She began to sort in her mind the individuals whose lives were most immediately linked with his. The first, naturally, was Mrs. Clara Hayward. She was younger than her husband by nearly 20 years, a striking woman with smooth golden hair and a way of moving that seemed ever so slightly theatrical. To the casual eye, she was the very model of a dutiful wife. Yet Miss Marple, who never allowed herself to be blinded by appearances, had noticed something cool in the lady's manner toward her husband at recent gatherings. A faint impatience, perhaps, when he lingered too long in a conversation, or a studied smile when he praised her cooking at the vicarage supper. It was the sort of look, Miss Marple mused, that often indicated restlessness. Clara Hayward was seated in the drawing room when Miss Marple called later that afternoon. Was that phrase again, spoken with just the faintest strain, as he always does. It was not the speech of a woman encountering such an absence for the first time. Miss Marple allowed the matter to rest, for she knew people often revealed more when they believed themselves unobserved. As she departed, she noted the way Mrs. Hayward's eyes lingered upon a small photograph on the side table. It was not of her husband, but of a tall, dark-haired man in military uniform, smiling with a reckless air. That, Miss Marple thought, was decidedly interesting. From the Haywards' neat house on the high street, Miss Marple next turned her attention to the pharmacy. Mr. Albert Finch, the village chemist, had long been known for his precision and his fondness for discussing remedies. Yet he had a nervous way about him, a tendency to avoid direct questions when they touched upon his business. On this occasion, Miss Marple entered under the pretext of purchasing some lotion for her rheumatism. "Ah, good day, Miss Marple," said Finch, his narrow face pale above his white coat. "How may I assist you?" She made her request in her usual mild tones, then remarked casually, "Such a shock about Dr. Hayward, is it not? To vanish so suddenly. It must have quite disordered his prescriptions." Finch dropped a jar upon the counter with a clatter and fumbled to set it upright. "Oh, yes, indeed. Quite distressing. Though I dare say he will turn up, as they say. These matters often have simple explanations." "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed, her eyes falling upon his hands. There, faint though visible, were blue stains, the unmistakable mark of ink. He left a prescription half-written, did he not? One wonders what became of it. The chemist stiffened. "I should not know, madam. The surgery is the inspector's concern, not mine." But his tone carried more than nervousness. It carried fear. Miss Marple accepted her lotion and departed with her usual courtesy. But in her mind she marked Finch down as a man with something to conceal. The third person who came under consideration was Major Henry Coulter, a retired— "Mark my words, he'll be found in Brighton with some painted hussy." His listeners tittered, but Miss Marple, seated a little apart, studied him keenly. He spoke loudly and confidently, yet his eyes darted toward Mrs. Hayward as she passed along the road. And she, though she kept her face composed, seemed for a moment to stiffen at the sound of his voice. It was a fleeting glance, but to Miss Marple it suggested some private understanding between them, however slight. Lastly, there was Nurse Lydia Crane, the doctor's assistant of many years. Tall, capable, and always brisk in manner, she was respected throughout the village for her efficiency. Yet efficiency could sometimes conceal resentment, Miss Marple knew. A nurse might find herself eclipsed by her employer, her skill unacknowledged, her devotion unrewarded. And if Dr. Hayward had been harsh or ungrateful, might she not have borne a secret grudge? Miss Marple encountered her at the vicarage tea the following afternoon, where Lydia poured tea with a steady hand but answered questions about the doctor with curt brevity. "He is a good man," she said firmly, "and he has worked himself beyond reason. I expect he has gone away for a rest, nothing more." But her lips were pressed tightly together as she spoke, and her eyes slid away from Miss Marple's gaze. It was not, the elderly spinster thought, the natural manner of a woman with nothing to hide. So, in the space of a single day, Miss Marple had assembled the beginnings of her list. Clara Hayward, the too-young wife with restless eyes. Albert Finch, the nervous chemist. Major Coulter, the quarrelsome neighbor. And Nurse Lydia Crane, the efficient but secretive assistant. Each had ties to the doctor, and each, so it seemed, possessed motives that might bear closer scrutiny. Of course, in a village, motives often overlapped with petty quarrels and private jealousies, which might appear serious to the participants, yet mean nothing more than human nature at its most ordinary. But Miss Marple had long ago learned that it is precisely in such ordinary corners that one often finds the root of darker deeds. That evening, seated once more in her parlor with her knitting, morning broke with a soft drizzle, the kind that left drops clinging to the roses and brought a faint smell of damp earth into the air. St. Mary Mead wore its usual quiet face, yet beneath the surface, speculation had grown overnight into something near feverish. It was as though the entire village, from the grocer's boy to the vicar's wife, had taken it upon themselves to become amateur sleuths. Each had their own theory about Dr. Hayward's absence, and each was most eager to share it. At the post office, Miss Hartnell confided to Mrs. Price Ridley that she had seen a shadow moving by the church gate at 9:30 on Tuesday night, though she could not say whether it had been the doctor or simply a passer-by. At the bakery, Mrs. Bantry whispered that she had heard a motor car racing down the London road around midnight, and she was sure, quite sure, it had been the doctor at the wheel. At the butcher's, young Tommy Briggs announced that his cousin in Much Benham had seen a man in a hat resembling Dr. Hayward's boarding the late train. Miss Marple, who stopped in at each place for her errands, listened with quiet attention. It was her way never to dismiss village talk, for amid the gossip there was often a kernel of truth. People might embroider their tales, but the smallest, least considered remark could sometimes reveal far more than the speaker intended. By late morning, Inspector Craddock himself had come again to St. Mary Mead, looking more harried than ever. He was a man of solid build with thinning hair, and a patience often sorely tested by the peculiarities of village life. Yet for all his gruffness, he respected Miss Marple, though he did not always admit it openly. They met outside the surgery, where the door remained firmly locked, a symbol of absence that seemed to weigh upon the villagers more each day. "Good morning, Inspector," Miss Marple said, adjusting her hat against the drizzle. "You must be very busy." "Busy," he echoed with a weary sigh. "That's one way of putting it. We've no body, no letter, no hint of foul play. Just a doctor who's disappeared into thin air. I'll be the laughingstock of the county if I can't in the village admits to summoning him that evening." "Then perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, "the summons was not official. A more private matter, perhaps. One he did not wish to record." Inspector Craddock looked at her sharply. "You mean a secret meeting? Blackmail or some such?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. She merely smiled that mild, infuriatingly wise smile of hers and asked instead, "Did you notice the chemist's hands yesterday? Such curious blue stains. Ink, I believe." The inspector frowned. "Finch? Yes, I saw them. said he'd been tallying his accounts. But between ourselves, he looked jumpy as a rabbit. We'll be having another word with him." Miss Marple gave a small nod. It was enough to know the inspector had registered her observation. She never pressed her suggestions too far. Men disliked to be told, though they were often glad to discover matters for themselves. Later that day, Miss Marple walked slowly down the lane toward the old mill, her parasol tapping gently on the damp stones. She liked to think while she walked, and the mill pond, with its weeping willows dipping into the water, seemed a suitable place for reflection. The air there was heavy with the scent of wet grass, and the only sound was the quiet plop of a frog sliding into the pond. It was there, quite by chance, or perhaps not by chance, that she spied something half hidden among the reeds. Stooping carefully, she drew it forth. A pair of leather gloves, well made, slightly worn, with the initials L.H. stamped discreetly upon the lining. Dr. Leonard Hayward's gloves. Miss Marple turned them over in her hands, her lips pursed. Why should his gloves be here, by the mill pond? Had he come here willingly, or been brought? She tucked them into her reticule and continued her walk, her eyes sharper than ever. That evening, a small gathering assembled at the vicarage for tea, as was customary. Mrs. Clement had laid out a spread of seed cake and cucumber sandwiches, and though the occasion was meant to be cheerful, talk inevitably circled back to chattering as they passed through the churchyard path. "Did you hear?" one whispered. "Mrs. Hayward was seen near the mill on Tuesday night, alone. Mary Evans swears she saw her clear as anything." Miss Marple's brows rose ever so slightly. That was interesting indeed. If the doctor's gloves were at the mill, and his wife had been seen there the same night. Yet she did not leap to conclusions. It was seldom wise to accept the most obvious explanation. Human nature was too fond of misdirection, too eager to conceal its true motives beneath convenient appearances. Still, when Miss Marple returned to her cottage, she set her knitting aside earlier than usual. She placed the gloves upon her little writing desk and studied them in the lamplight. They were damp when she had found them, but now they were drying stiffly, as though they had lain by the pond all night. A pair of gloves by a mill pond, a half-written prescription in a deserted surgery, a chemist with ink-stained fingers, a wife who spoke too lightly of her husband's absences, a nurse whose silence spoke louder than words. The threads of the puzzle were gathering. They had not yet formed a pattern, but Miss Marple knew it was there, waiting to be drawn out by patience and observation. And so, as the church clock struck 9 and the village settled into uneasy sleep, she sat by her window with her knitting, her needles clicking softly, her mind sharper than ever. The doctor had vanished, yes, but gloves and ink and whispers do not vanish. They linger, waiting for the eye that can see them clearly. Miss Marple intended to be that eye. Chapter 4. The Garden Party. The drizzle of the previous morning had given way to bright sunshine, and with it the village had taken on a cheerful air, as though determined to forget, at least for a time, the strange shadow of the vanished doctor. The hedgerows glittered with dew, children darted about in the lanes, and the larks sang as if to reassure St. Mary Mead that life must go on, no matter the mystery that hovered in its midst. It was therefore fortunate, or perhaps less so, that the Women's Institute garden party had long been scheduled. Flags. Ladies in floral frocks presided over stalls of needlework, potted plants, and second-hand books. Miss Marple, dressed in her best summer hat trimmed with faded blue ribbon, took up a quiet seat near the rose border. From there, with her knitting in her lap, she could observe without appearing to do so. People rarely noticed an elderly lady with needles clicking away. They forgot she was listening as well as knitting. The first person to draw her attention was Mr. Arthur Finch, the chemist. He stood at the edge of the crowd, speaking earnestly to Mr. Harper, the solicitor. Finch was pale, his hands twitching nervously. Twice he wiped them on his handkerchief, as though perspiration troubled him. Miss Marple recalled those curious blue stains she had observed earlier. Ink, he had claimed, but his manner suggested a greater unease. Mr. Harper, for his part, was nodding gravely, though from time to time his eyes darted across the lawn, as if anxious not to be seen in such earnest conversation. When Finch at last hurried away, Harper remained, looking thoughtful and troubled, before retreating toward the bookstall with undue haste. Not far from them, Lydia Crane stood in her neat nurse's uniform. She rarely seemed to wear anything else. She had volunteered to supervise the first aid tent, though in truth there was little for her to do. Her eyes, sharp and restless, seemed to follow Mrs. Hayward, who had arrived late in the company of Colonel Melrose and his wife. Mrs. Hayward looked more fragile than ever, her pale blue dress emphasizing her slenderness. But she carried herself with a sort of quiet dignity that invited sympathy. "Poor soul," murmured Mrs. Bantry, bustling past Miss Marple with a plate of seed cake. "She's bearing up bravely, don't you think? Though I cannot help wondering if she knows more than she lets on." Miss Marple gave a non-committal smile. It was always unwise to declare opinions too soon. Presently, Inspector Craddock appeared. He did not look at ease among raffles and sponge cakes, but his presence was a reminder that the mystery of the doctor's disappearance was far from solved. He exchanged a few polite, "Hayward be carrying such a thing in her handbag? Had she taken it absent-mindedly? Or did it signify something more deliberate?" The incident passed quickly enough, with laughter and polite remarks. But Miss Marple's mind was now occupied. Later, as she strolled past the potted plant stall, she overheard part of a conversation between Nurse Crane and Colonel Melrose. "And I assure you," the nurse was saying in low tones, "he was not himself at all that week. Distracted, forgetful, even irritable. Quite unlike him." The colonel, bluff and red-faced, gave a grunt. "Overwork, that's what it was. Man can't be running off at all hours without it taking a toll. But you mark my words, nurse, there's more to it. Men don't vanish for no reason. No reason at all." Nurse Crane's lips tightened, but she said nothing further. Meanwhile, Arthur Finch lingered near the refreshment table, fidgeting so much that he upset a glass of lemonade onto his cuff. He muttered apologies and withdrew, but not before Miss Marple noticed him slip a folded envelope into his inner pocket. He glanced about furtively, as though fearing observation. The afternoon wore on with games for the children, and a slightly off-key rendering of "God Save the King" by the brass band. Yet beneath the gaiety there was a tension, an undercurrent that all could feel but none would name aloud. The absence of Dr. Hayward hung over the fete like an uninvited guest. As the sun began to sink, Miss Marple made her way home, her mind filled with impressions. She had noted 3 things of significance: Mrs. Hayward's possession of a prescription slip, Finch's secretive manner and ink-stained hands, and Nurse Crane's telling remark about the doctor's recent distraction. Each might mean little in isolation. Together, they suggested a web of secrets. That evening, as she sat in her cottage with her knitting, Miss Marple turned the clues over in her mind. It was human nature, she reflected, to believe what one wished to believe. The villagers wished to see Mrs. Hayward as the tragic, delicate wife, incapable. Description was seen boarding the midnight train on Tuesday, alone, carrying a small case. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though she said nothing at once. "You don't believe it, do you?" the inspector asked, half accusing, half resigned. "I believe," Miss Marple said gently, "that such sightings are often mistaken. People see what they expect to see. A tall man with a dark coat may be any number of persons. But tell me, Inspector, was this small case ever found among the doctor's belongings?" "No," Craddock admitted reluctantly. "His wife insists he never owned one like it." "Then," Miss Marple murmured, "it is very curious indeed." The inspector sighed. "Everything about this case is curious. I sometimes wish you'd take it over from me." "Oh no, Inspector," Miss Marple replied with a little laugh. "I only knit and observe. The real work is yours." But after he had gone, she sat long by the window, her knitting idle in her lap. A man who disappeared with a small case, a wife who carried prescription slips, a chemist with ink-stained fingers, a nurse who hinted at secrets. The picture was growing more tangled, yet in that tangle Miss Marple sensed the threads that might one day be drawn into a pattern. She only hoped she might untangle them before something worse than disappearance came to light. Chapter 5. The Chemist's Secret. The morning after the garden party dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crisp air that carried the scent of roses across hedges and over garden walls. St. Mary Mead, outwardly, appeared to be the very picture of tranquility. Yet beneath the calm, the mystery of Dr. Hayward's disappearance stirred uneasily, like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward with every passing day. Miss Marple, seated by her parlor window with her usual knitting, allowed her thoughts to turn once more to Mr. Arthur Finch, the village chemist. Of all those connected with the doctor, Finch's behavior had been the most peculiar, nervous, evasive, with those telltale ink stains upon his fingers. He had the air of a man carrying some secret burden. Whether that burden related to Dr. Hayward was another matter. But Miss Marple had lived too long not to suspect that secrets often entwined with mysteries in ways one did not at first anticipate. She decided, therefore, that a visit to the chemist's shop would not come amiss. The little pharmacy on the high street stood as it had for decades, a narrow building with a bell over the door that tinkled faintly whenever a customer entered. Inside, the air was thick with the sharp, clean smell of camphor and menthol, mingled with the sweeter scent of lavender water. Glass jars lined the shelves, filled with powders and tablets, while behind the counter stood the familiar figure of Arthur Finch himself. He started when Miss Marple entered, as though caught unawares, then quickly composed himself. "Good morning, Miss Marple. How may I assist you today?" "Why, good morning, Mr. Finch," Miss Marple said sweetly. "I thought I might trouble you for some liniment. My rheumatism has been troublesome of late." Of course," Finch replied hastily, retreating behind the counter to fetch a small brown bottle. His hands, Miss Marple noticed, trembled ever so slightly as he wrapped it in paper. "Such a trying business about poor Dr. Hayward," she continued in her mildest tones. "The whole village is quite at sixes and sevens. One hardly knows what to think." Her order. Leaving Miss Marple to browse the shelves, she made a small show of examining a bottle of cough syrup, but her eyes were drawn to the counter. There, partly concealed by a ledger, lay an envelope with writing upon it. Only 2 words were visible: Dr. Hayward. Miss Marple asked no questions. She merely paid for her liniment, thanked Finch, and departed, her mind quietly turning. Outside, she encountered Mrs. Bantry bustling along with her basket. "My dear Miss Marple, you've been to the chemist, I see. Did you notice how pale he looks? Mark my words, that man is hiding something. I shouldn't be surprised if he knows where the doctor has gone." Miss Marple murmured agreement, though she did not voice her true thought. That gossip often sprang from observation, but rarely from accurate interpretation. That afternoon, Inspector Craddock paid another visit to the village. Miss Marple invited him to take tea, which he accepted with his usual gruff politeness. Over sponge cake and a pot of china tea, she shared her small observations. "Finch was most nervous," she said mildly, "and I could not help but notice an envelope bearing the doctor's name." Craddock frowned. "We've already asked Finch for the doctor's correspondence. He claimed there was nothing unusual, just accounts and prescription notes. Did you see what was inside the envelope?" "No," Miss Marple admitted. "It would have been most improper to pry. But I have always found, Inspector, that nervous men seldom conceal nothing at all. And sometimes it is not wickedness, but foolishness that they hide." The inspector snorted. "With Finch, I'd believe either. We'll have another look at him." Later that evening, events took a curious turn. Word spread quickly through the village that Finch's shop had been found locked early, the blinds drawn, and no sign of the chemist himself. By the following morning, whispers ran rampant. Finch had vanished, just as Dr. Hayward had. Mrs. Price Ridley was the first to declare that the chemist must have murdered the doctor and fled. "Mark my words, Miss Marple, it is always the quiet ones." Inspector, though unconvinced, could not prove otherwise. To the villagers, however, Finch's absence was proof enough of guilt. His name was whispered at every tea table, his shop patronized less than ever. Even Mrs. Bantry confessed she would rather fetch aspirin from Much Benham than from her own chemist. Miss Marple, however, was not persuaded. "People do not always lie to conceal guilt," she remarked to the vicar one evening. "Sometimes they lie to avoid embarrassment, or shame, or even kindness. Mr. Finch may be foolish, but that does not mean he is wicked. And I cannot help feeling, dear Reverend, that the true explanation of Dr. Hayward's disappearance lies elsewhere." Yet she continued to ponder Finch's behavior. The envelope with Hayward's name, the nervous manner, the sudden absence to Bath, these were not meaningless. They were threads, but perhaps not the ones that formed the main pattern. And then, just as the village began to settle once more into uneasy routine, a fresh clue emerged. It came from young Tommy Briggs, the butcher's boy, who delivered a note to Miss Marple one morning. It was scrawled hastily on cheap paper, unsigned, and it read, "If you want to know the truth about the doctor, ask Finch about the prescription." Miss Marple folded the note carefully and slipped it beneath her knitting. The chemist's secret, it seemed, was not finished with yet. Chapter 6. The Lady in Blue. The note had disturbed Miss Marple less by its words than by its manner. Anonymous letters were, in her experience, rarely the work of hardened criminals. More often they sprang from fear, malice, or the desire to shift suspicion elsewhere. Yet such notes, she knew, could point the way if one read them in the spirit in which they were written. Ask Finch about the prescription. It was an odd phrase. Prescriptions, after all, were Finch's daily business. Why should one in particular hold significance? Unless, of course, it were the unfinished draft for Mrs. Hayward. The one Dr. Hayward had begun on the very night of it, still there trembling. "How kind of you to come, Miss Marple," she said with a faint smile. "The days have been so very long." Miss Marple returned the smile with gentle sympathy. "Indeed, my dear, they must weigh heavily. The uncertainty is the hardest thing, I always think." "Yes," Mrs. Hayward whispered. Her eyes filled suddenly with tears, which she brushed away with quick impatience. "Forgive me. I feel I must appear foolish to everyone, so weak." "Not weak," Miss Marple said softly. "Only human." They sat together for a time, speaking of small matters, the roses in the garden, the success of the garden party, the kindness of the vicar's wife. Miss Marple knew better than to press too soon. But after a while she leaned forward, her voice mild. "I could not help noticing, dear, that at the fete you carried one of the doctor's prescription slips. Such things are often so easily mislaid. It must be difficult to have reminders about." For a moment Mrs. Hayward went very still. Then she gave a little laugh, too light, too quick. "Oh, that! Yes, indeed, I must have picked it up by accident. Leonard often left them about the house. You know how men are." Miss Marple nodded, though her eyes, blue and penetrating, lingered on the younger woman's face. "Quite so. And yet it was folded, as though one meant to keep it." A flush crept into Mrs. Hayward's cheeks. She looked away, her hands twisting in her lap. "It was nothing, really. Only that I could not sleep, you see. The draft he prepared was meant for me. And I suppose I wanted to keep it, like a token. Foolish, isn't it?" Miss Marple murmured something soothing, but inwardly she was not satisfied. A woman might keep a lock of hair, a letter, even an old glove, but a prescription slip. It seemed too clinical, too unromantic, unless it served some other purpose. As she left the house, Miss Marple once. But that is another story. The inspector sighed. "Very well. We'll keep an eye on her. But I warn you, Miss Marple, if I find she's deceiving us, I won't spare her feelings." "No," Miss Marple said quietly. "I dare say you won't." The following day brought further whispers. Mrs. Price Ridley, never one to miss an opportunity for gossip, declared in the post office that she had seen Mrs. Hayward walking near the mill again, this time in the dusk, her blue shawl quite unmistakable. "And what's more," she added triumphantly, "she had a parcel with her. A parcel, mind you. Now what would a respectable lady be doing with a parcel by the mill after dark?" The story spread like wildfire. By the time Miss Marple heard it from Miss Hartnell, it had grown. Mrs. Hayward had been carrying a heavy box. Mrs. Hayward had been meeting a stranger. Mrs. Hayward had thrown something into the pond. Each retelling embroidered the tale, until the poor lady was all but condemned. Miss Marple, however, remained thoughtful rather than convinced. She took an evening walk herself down to the mill pond, where the willows trailed their branches in the dark water. The surface was calm, reflecting the pale glow of the moon. Yet when she peered closely, she thought she saw something glinting beneath the reeds. A silver locket, perhaps, or a button. She did not attempt to retrieve it in the dark, but made a note to return by daylight. That night she slept little. Her dreams were full of blue dresses, of parcels vanishing into water, of prescription slips folded in trembling hands. The next morning Miss Marple did indeed return to the mill. After some effort, using her parasol as a makeshift hook, she drew from the reeds a sodden handkerchief, lace-edged, delicate, and embroidered with the initials E.H. Eleanor Hayward. Miss Marple carried it home in her reticule, dried it carefully, and sat considering it. A handkerchief in the mill pond might mean very little. It could have been dropped by accident. Yet combined with the whispers, the gloves, and the Hayward house once more. Through the open window she heard the sound of sobbing, quickly stifled. And then Nurse Crane's voice, low but urgent. "You must not tell them, madam. You promised. For all our sakes you must keep silent." Miss Marple's step slowed, her face grave in the twilight. Whatever secret bound the nurse and the doctor's wife together, it lay at the heart of the mystery. And secrets, she knew, had a way of coming to light, whether one wished them to or not. Chapter 7. The Broken Teacup. There is, Miss Marple often reflected, something peculiarly revealing about tea. People may guard their expressions and weigh their words, but over a teacup, poured, offered, sipped, truths are betrayed in gestures, hesitations, even the accidental break of porcelain. It was with this conviction in mind that she accepted Mrs. Price Ridley's invitation to tea the very next afternoon. The widow was not one of Miss Marple's closest friends. She was far too fond of pronouncing judgments in ringing tones, but she was a nexus of information. If there were whispers in the village, they would settle inevitably in her parlor, like dust upon polished mahogany. Mrs. Price Ridley bustled in her stiff black dress, poured strong lapsang into delicate cups, and leaned forward. "You have heard, I suppose, of the handkerchief found at the mill? Eleanor Hayward's initials upon it, plain as day. There can be no doubt she went there. And why, Miss Marple? Why, if not to dispose of something she ought not to have had?" Miss Marple smiled gently, adding a small drop of milk to her cup. "Handkerchiefs, dear, do have a way of traveling. I once knew one that went from a gentleman's breast pocket to a washerwoman's basket, to a child's playhouse, and finally to the pond, all within 3 days." Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed. "You are always inclined to leniency, Miss Marple. But mark my words, the doctor's wife is not so meek as she appears. I've observed her myself, oh yes. Once at market she bargained so sharply over—" "Quite so," said Miss Marple mildly. "But one always must think, mustn't one? Otherwise, well, one might be misled. Tell me, Mr. Finch, about prescriptions. Suppose one were made up for a patient, but never delivered. What becomes of it?" Finch blinked rapidly. "Why, it would be destroyed, naturally. Regulations, you see." "Indeed. Not kept on the shelves, then?" "Oh, no, no. Not unless there were a reason." Miss Marple's needles clicked gently in her lap. "And was there reason, perhaps, in Mrs. Hayward's case? For I understood Dr. Hayward had prescribed her something on the very evening he disappeared." Finch dropped the spool of twine he was cutting. It rolled across the counter. His hand trembled as he retrieved it. "Well, I cannot speak of such matters, Miss Marple. Professional confidentiality, you understand." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with deceptive mildness. Of course, dear Mr. Finch. Confidentiality is the soul of trust. Yet sometimes it is also the cloak of fear. Finch flushed scarlet and busied himself with arranging bottles. She did not press further, but she had seen enough. Finch knew something he dared not speak. The following day brought a new disturbance. At the Hayward house, a maid dropped a tray of china in the hall. Among the fragments, one teacup remained oddly whole but for a jagged crack along its rim. Miss Marple, arriving at that moment to deliver flowers, bent to examine it. Curious, she murmured. A clean break, yet not shattered. Almost as if struck against something hard. Mrs. Hayward, flustered, insisted it was nothing. Only clumsiness, Miss Marple. The girl has been nervous. But later, when Miss Marple sat with her in the drawing room, she noticed another fragment, hidden beneath the settee. This piece bore a faint brown stain, as of some liquid dried into the porcelain. Not tea, Miss Marple thought, but perhaps something medicinal. When she slipped the shard into her reticule, Mrs. Hayward's eyes widened in sudden fear. Please don't trouble yourself before judging its design. Craddock groaned. Sometimes, Miss Marple, I think you delight in tormenting me. Not torment, dear Inspector. Merely patience. 2 evenings later, another whisper reached her, this time from the vicar's wife, who came breathless to the cottage. My dear Jane, you won't believe it. Mrs. Hayward was seen again by the mill, only last night. Lydia Crane with her this time. They had a lantern. What on earth can they be doing there? Miss Marple, concealing her excitement, said only, Lanterns are useful things, especially when one seeks what the day may not reveal. The next morning she walked once more to the mill pond, and there upon the bank where reeds grew thick, she saw fresh footprints, 2 sets, one lighter, one heavier. And in the mud beside them lay another object, the clasp of a leather bag, broken clean off. She held it in her palm, considering. A bag clasp, a broken cup, a stained shard, a prescription unfinished, a nurse urging silence, and a frightened wife in blue. The case, Miss Marple knew, was drawing near its heart. The question was not only what had happened to Dr. Hayward, but what these women were so desperate to conceal. And as she turned homeward, the autumn wind stirred through the willows, whispering secrets like voices from the water. Chapter 8. Lanterns by the Mill. The following evening, St. Mary Mead seemed hushed beneath a veil of expectancy. Even the usual gossip at the grocer's had a subdued air, as though the whole village sensed something nearing its conclusion. Miss Marple, however, knitted serenely by her fire, a single candle burning beside her. She had made her decision. For 2 nights running, Mrs. Hayward and Nurse Crane had been observed by the mill pond with a lantern. And now, with the clasp from a leather bag lying in the mud, there could be little doubt they were searching for something. Or perhaps concealing it. Miss Marple knew from long experience that when women went furtively abroad together at night, the explanation was seldom innocent. At 1:30, voice broke. She covered her face with her hands. Miss Marple did not intrude. She lingered in the shadows, the words carrying clearly across the still water. A stronger mind than most might have dismissed such a scene as harmless folly, but Miss Marple's mind was trained to weigh the subtleties of desperation. Something had been cast into the pond, something the women now sought desperately to retrieve, At last they extinguished the lantern and hurried away, skirts catching on brambles, footsteps quick on the damp earth. Only when silence fell did Miss Marple step forward. She knelt at the spot where they had been searching, probing gently with the ferrule of her umbrella. The mud yielded nothing but a fragment of sodden cloth. Yet even that fragment was suggestive. Blue serge, like the hem of Mrs. Hayward's gown, perhaps torn in the struggle to conceal or recover what had been thrown. She carried it home in her pocket. The next morning brought Inspector Craddock to her cottage, looking grim. "Miss Marple, I've had just about enough of wild goose chases. Finch swears the prescription was harmless. Lydia Crane avoids straight answers, and now the whole village insists Eleanor Hayward is guilty of murder. If I don't come up with something solid, the chief constable will have my head." Miss Marple poured tea into his cup and passed the scones. "Patience, Inspector. One must not be hurried. Consider, if you will, a missing doctor, a frightened wife, a nurse sworn to secrecy, a chemist trembling over prescriptions, and nightly visits to the mill pond. They are pieces of a puzzle, but they do not yet fit into the shape of murder." Craddock scowled. "Then what shape do you think they make?" "Ah," said Miss Marple serenely, "that is what we are to discover. But tell me, have you searched the doctor's bag?" "The bag? The one he carried on his rounds. Doctors seldom go anywhere without it." Craddock admitted they had not. The bag was not among the things in his surgery, nor in the house. "Precisely," murmured Miss Marple. "And yet we have found a broken clasp by the pond." A clasp, instruments, was one object that made Inspector Craddock whistle low. A small glass phial, tightly stoppered. He turned to Finch, the chemist, who had been summoned to the scene. "What's this, Finch?" Finch turned pale. That is chloral hydrate, a strong sedative, dangerous in careless hands." "And would Dr. Hayward have prescribed it for his wife?" Finch hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Yes, he had recently. She suffered from nervous sleeplessness, you see. He asked me to prepare a draft." At once the villagers erupted in a buzz of scandalized whispers. Mrs. Hayward, hearing them, turned deathly white and swayed as though she might faint. Lydia Crane caught her arm protectively. Craddock rounded on them. "So that's what you've been hiding. You feared the sedative had killed him. That's it, isn't it? You dosed him by mistake, and when he died you hid the bag to protect yourselves." Mrs. Hayward cried out, but Miss Marple raised her hand calmly. "Do not be hasty, Inspector. The truth is seldom as simple as it first appears." Craddock flushed, but he held his tongue. That evening Miss Marple sat long by her fire, piecing together the puzzle. A bag cast into the pond, a sedative prescribed, a broken teacup stained with draught, and women creeping by lantern light to recover what they had hidden. All these pointed to guilt, but not, she felt certain, to the guilt of murder, rather to the guilt of fear. The next morning she visited Mrs. Hayward. She found her seated alone, pale and trembling. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "I think it would ease your heart to tell me the truth, for I believe you have carried a burden not of crime, but of shame." Tears filled the young woman's eyes. "Oh, Miss Marple, you do not know. You cannot know. It is too dreadful." "I have lived long, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "I have seen many dreadful things, but I have also seen that honesty is lighter to bear than silence." Mrs. Hayward clasped her hand on the hearth, casting flickering shadows across polished oak and velvet chairs. Though the atmosphere was cozy, those assembled were anything but at ease. Eleanor Hayward sat pale and still, her hands twisting ceaselessly in her lap. Beside her, Lydia Crane kept a firm, protective hand upon her shoulder, her eyes defiant. Arthur Finch, the chemist, stood by the mantelpiece, his fingers drumming nervously against the marble. Mrs. Price Ridley and Mrs. Bantry occupied chairs opposite, their expressions eager with curiosity. Inspector Craddock, arms folded, leaned grimly against the window, clearly impatient for Miss Marple to begin. At last, Miss Marple herself entered, her small figure wrapped in a shawl, knitting bag upon her arm. She looked from face to face with her usual gentle smile, as though they were gathered for nothing more dramatic than a parish fete. "My dear friends," she began in her soft, quavery voice, "thank you for coming. We are here because of a most distressing business, the disappearance of Dr. Hayward. Much has been said, many suspicions cast, but I believe the time has come to put all such speculation to rest. For the truth, though veiled, has been before us all along." A murmur ran through the room. Mrs. Price Ridley leaned forward eagerly. Yes, Miss Marple, do get on with it. Who killed the man?" Miss Marple raised a hand mildly. "My dear Mrs. Price Ridley, we must not leap to conclusions. Murder is not always the explanation. Indeed, in this case, I believe there has been no murder at all." At this, gasps broke out. Craddock frowned heavily. "No murder? Then where the devil is he?" "That," said Miss Marple serenely, "is the question to which the answer lies in small, everyday details. Details one might overlook, yet together they form a pattern." She settled herself in a chair, her needles clicking softly, as though the rhythm aided her thoughts. "Consider first the matter of the chemist," she went on. "Poor Mr. Finch has been much maligned. He was observed in panic, not in crime." Eleanor Hayward uttered a faint cry. Miss Marple's eyes rested upon her gently. "My dear Mrs. Hayward, you feared the world would think you guilty of your husband's death. That is why you and Nurse Crane sought to conceal his bag in the pond. You feared that, should the sedative be found, all would believe you had poisoned him." Tears brimmed in Eleanor's eyes. "It is true. He had prescribed me the draught. I poured it into his tea that night, hoping he would sleep, for he was so irritable, so restless. But then he vanished, and when I found the broken cup, oh, Miss Marple, I was sure everyone would think I had killed him." A stir ran through the room. Mrs. Bantry patted her hand consolingly, while Mrs. Price Ridley pursed her lips, as though disappointed the tale was not bloodier. Inspector Craddock cleared his throat. "So, if it was not murder, what became of him?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Ah, yes. That is the final piece of the puzzle. Dr. Hayward, as some of you may know, had lately been much troubled, not by his patients, but by money. His practice was not flourishing. He had quarreled with his wife about economies, with Finch about accounts, even with the vicar about donations. A proud man, he could not bear to admit failure, and so he vanished." "Vanished?" "Indeed. He arranged it quite carefully. He left by night, taking with him certain funds from his account, and intended to start afresh elsewhere, under another name. But—" Miss Marple paused delicately. He did not reckon upon his wife's innocent act. The draught she gave him made him drowsy, too drowsy. When he attempted to make his journey by bicycle that night, he lost his balance upon the old bridge near the mill and fell into the water. His bag fell also. The bag we found, but not the man. A hush fell. Lydia Crane's face went ashen. "Then he is—" Miss Marple inclined her head gravely. "Yes, my dear." Lesson. Secrets are a heavier burden than truth. Better always to speak plainly, even when afraid. The gathering broke slowly, the villagers murmuring amongst themselves. Mrs. Price Ridley declared loudly that she had always suspected some such explanation. Finch breathed a sigh of relief while Lydia Crane guided Eleanor tenderly from the room. Inspector Craddock lingered to shake Miss Marple's hand with a mixture of gratitude and exasperation. "You've a way of making us all look like fools, Miss Marple. But I dare say we need it." Miss Marple smiled serenely. "Not fools, Inspector. Only too hasty. The truth, you see, is like embroidery. It takes patience, and the smallest stitches matter most." And with that, she gathered her shawl about her shoulders and made her way homeward, the night air crisp, the stars bright above the quiet village. Chapter 10. Tea, Truth, and Tranquility. Morning in St. Mary Mead dawned with an uncharacteristic brilliance. A crispness in the air promised the end of summer and the first whispers of autumn. Gardens sparkled with dew, roses held their heads high, and the distant church bell tolled the half-hour, as though to remind the village of the ordered rhythm of life after the storm of suspicion and secrecy. In the snug drawing-room of Miss Marple's neat little cottage, the curtains had been drawn back to allow the full sweep of sunlight. A pot of steaming tea stood on the lace-covered table, flanked by a plate of currant scones and a dish of homemade strawberry jam. Everything had been prepared with quiet precision, as though nothing of moment had ever disturbed the peace of St. Mary Mead. And yet, within the cottage walls, a most momentous conversation was about to unfold. Gathered there were Inspector Crail, solid and uncomfortable in his stiff uniform chair; Miss Lydia Harcourt, pale but resolute; Mr. Felix Cartwright, appearing considerably less self-assured than usual; Mrs. Barton, her lips compressed tightly together; and young Peter Bligh, flushed and nervous, clasping his cap between clammy hands. Miss Marple herself sat serene. Could not have been voluntary. He was a conscientious man. Such men do not absent themselves from their patients without notice, nor leave their surgery in disorder. But equally one must not leap to the melodramatic conclusion of murder when simpler explanations present themselves. Mrs. Barton sniffed. "I always said he was taken ill somewhere. I told the vicar's wife so. But no one listens to me." Miss Marple gave her a kind look. "A natural assumption, my dear. And yet, the signs pointed elsewhere. His bicycle, for instance, standing in the surgery. His bag upon the table. The clock unwound, the teacup half drunk. All very suggestive of a man interrupted." Peter Bligh shifted uneasily. If you please, Miss Marple. I never meant any harm. Truly, I didn't." "Quite so," Miss Marple said. "And you did not harm him. Though you were, as it happens, an unwilling witness to his final movements. You saw him leave the surgery that evening, did you not?" The boy's face turned crimson. "Yes, ma'am. I was loitering. That is, I was looking for a cat. A very elusive cat, Miss Marple interjected kindly, sparing him further embarrassment. You saw him leave with a small case. Not his medical bag, but another. A dark leather attaché, did you not? Peter nodded miserably. I didn't think it mattered. But it mattered very much indeed. For you see, Miss Marple continued, turning her gaze upon Lydia Harcourt, the case contains certain documents relating to your late father's estate. Dr. Leonard had been entrusted with them. He had, I believe, promised you he would review them before your meeting with Mr. Cartwright. Lydia inclined her head, her expression one of grave acknowledgement. That is true. He was kind enough to help me, as I was unsure of certain legal points. Felix Cartwright's face had gone a shade paler. He interjected sharply. Really, Miss Marple, this line of confront you. Poor man, he had no notion how dangerous that resolve would prove. Inspector Crail leaned forward. You mean to say Dr. Leonard did meet with Cartwright that evening? Yes, and he confronted him with the evidence. It was not murder in the planned sense, you understand. Mr. Cartwright had no design upon his life, but tempers flared. Harsh words were spoken, and when Dr. Leonard threatened exposure, Mr. Cartwright struck him. A single blow, fatal in its effect. Lydia gave a small cry and covered her face. It was panic thereafter, Miss Marple went on gently. The body was concealed hurriedly, the abandoned well in the copse beyond the Harcourt fields, so conveniently forgotten by most, offered concealment. But concealment does not escape. Truth, like water, rises sooner or later to the surface. Cartwright had half risen from his seat. His suave manner was gone. His hands trembled. You've no evidence. It's all supposition from a meddling old woman. Miss Marple's eyes met his, cool and steady. The evidence will suffice, I assure you. Inspector Crail has already retrieved the documents from the false bottom of your study desk, with Mr. Pritchard as witness. And the constables, as we sit here, are recovering Dr. Leonard's remains from that very well. The inspector gave a sharp nod. We found the papers where she said, Your goose is cooked, Cartwright. Cartwright collapsed back into his chair, his composure utterly shattered. A broken man, he buried his face in his hands. Miss Marple poured herself a fresh cup of tea, her expression touched with sadness. It is always grievous to see how clever men, who might have lived respectable lives, stumble when pride and ambition tempt them astray. Poor Dr. Leonard was but the unfortunate obstacle in Mr. Cartwright's path. The atmosphere in the room was heavy with shock, yet curiously relieved. The uncertainty had ended. Truth had been spoken, and though tragic, it carried with it a kind of done our work for us once again. There'll be formalities, of course, but the case is as good as closed. You've an uncommon knack. Oh, not uncommon at all, Miss Marple said with her little smile. One sees so many human dramas play out in a village such as ours. They may be writ small, but they follow the same pattern as those in the great world. A quarrel over money, a rash temper, an ill-considered action. Why, I've seen it often enough in trifles like parish quarrels over hymn books. It is only the scale that differs. The inspector gave a grunt of reluctant admiration and prepared to leave, escorting the broken Cartwright with him. Mrs. Barton departed at last, still exclaiming, and Lydia withdrew quietly, her eyes damp but her head held high. Peter trailed after, subdued. And then the little cottage was quiet again, save for the tick of the clock and the soft rustle of knitting needles. Miss Marple sat contentedly, sipping her tea. Outside, the sparrows chirped in the hedges, and the sound of children's laughter floated faintly across the green. Another village mystery had been solved, another balance restored. Life in St. Mary Mead could continue its placid course, with gossip and gardens, sewing circles and church bazaars. Yet behind the gentle facade, Miss Marple knew, human folly and frailty would ever provide material for those with eyes to see. She reached for a currant scone, spread it neatly with jam, and allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. For though the world could be dark with greed and weakness, there was comfort too, in truth, in justice, and in the simple blessing of tea shared in a quiet room.